So thank you all so much for joining today. We are going to be doing a roundtable on adoption, dissolution, and other topics that may pop up with these lovely ladies on this call. For those of you who don't know, Hope Baker, I've said it over and over again, but I wrote a book. I'm a birth mother, and I'm still so ignorant to so many things. There's just so many things that happen that I have no idea are common or even a factor. So, I shared my story, and I'm still learning every day. So I wanted to get this roundtable together so we could educate me, others, gain other perspectives. So let's kick it off. So the first question I wanted to tackle is, in this specific case and other cases that we seek, because now we know this is common, where did the professionals fail?
I think everybody's waiting for me to talk because here I am.
Carrie, why don't you go ahead? Alice and I can follow up with the social work perspective.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm Carrie Murray Nellis. I'm Director of Abiding Love Adoptions. We are not an international adoption agency, so I want to go on the record up front saying that we do not do international home studies. We only do domestic, and we're only licensed in Georgia, Alabama, and Florida. I am also an adoption attorney. I've been practicing for 15 years. I feel really old saying that. And I only do adoptions because I do other attorneys do other stuff. I don't know. So I'm kind of coming to this from two different perspectives of a professional. I'm also a social worker. And so I approve all of our home studies. So I think that one of the things I want to say is, adoption professionals have failed. We failed in the adoption world for way too long, in the domestic world, in the international world, you name it, we've failed. And I can't say that I've done everything right, but I feel like we have this, we're working on trying to change things. I feel like there's a huge, just a progress of that. As a social worker, I see, as I work with families who are coming to me, who are home study ready and wanting to adopt a baby that we're working with the expectant mom, I am amazed at people who say, oh yeah, I've been educated on X, Y, and Z. And then when we sit down to have a discussion, I'm like, nope, you haven't. And we're getting flack from, adoption consultants saying we're requiring too much of families and want too much. So I think that adoption professionals have failed in that we are not preparing families well enough. We are not preparing them for cultural differences. We are not preparing them for the nuances of just a child going from one culture to the other, of growing into a new, just a whole new country, a whole new culture of different people, a whole family. Many of these children haven't had a nuclear family or any kind of real interaction in that sense. A lot of children come from orphanages in the international arena. So we have failed, and it comes down to education. The other thing, from putting on my attorney hat, of something that I have seen, is I've had clients that wanted to adopt internationally, and they've gone through the home study process, and they've been given what they call a dossier of a child. And many times, and I'm not saying all the time, this is just my experience as an adoption professional attorney, the agency will put down a list of minor disabilities, things like that. And so they're like, okay, I'm interested. And then as they learn more and they start digging, it's a whole different animal of a different, disabilities or whatever it is. And they might not be prepared for that. And then many families, we find, are feeling like they've been they feel guilted into moving forward with the adoption, because if not, then this child is going to languish in this orphanage or in foster care, whatever it is. And so I've had clients come to me. I mean, I had one at 9 o'clock at night on a Saturday. I'll never forget. She's like, I'm so sorry. And we were friends as well as a client, but she just rang my doorbell and she's like, I just need to talk because I'm being pressured to adopt this child. And I know in my gut, this is not what is best for this child. And I know it's not what's best for my current family as it is. So all of that to say, we adoption professionals need to do a better job of looking at families, of what their capabilities are, not every family is capable of caring for a special needs adoption, a special needs baby. It's just not. My family, we are not lined up for that. I mean, I don't have the educational resources. I don't have all of the time resources. Um, my partner, Vicky, with the adoption agency, she has adopted several special needs children, and she's amazing at being able to get everybody to their therapies and do all those things. So I think one of the things adoption professionals need to do is to look at the client where they are and who they are, not trying to make them into something else or to do something else, but to look at who they are, what they really feel is on their heart to do, and not trying to manipulate or to encourage people to do something beyond their capabilities. So it goes back to education for me.
And Carrie, quick follow-up question on that. Do you, because like I said, I'm a birth mother, but I had no idea this was common. Didn't ever cross my mind. Do we also educate birth mothers? Do agencies educate birth mothers that this can happen and what happens if it does happen?
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm literally, you can see I am in my car here. I am at a hospital right now in a parking lot because I'm working with an expectant mom, and she's seen all of this stuff from the news, and that was one of the questions she asked me. She said, so what happens if they decide they don't want my baby anymore? And I honestly, in all of 15 years, I've never had an expectant mom or a birth mom ask me that. And so even though, look, I knew we were having this discussion today, and I've, been doing this, I was honestly like taken aback with it. But yeah, so we had to have a heart-to-heart talk. And again, I had to talk to her about what we do to make sure that the family that the possible family she has to choose from have been educated about adoption in itself, what that looks like, and then also transracial adoption. That's something we're really big on because I really don't believe love is enough. We've got to educate families and everybody to know all these things for cultural differences. So yeah, but we've got to talk to birth mothers about it. It's a tough place to talk with expectant moms and birth moms because a lot of time expectant moms I've worked with, they're already dealing with rejection issues and stuff. And so then they're like, am I going to be rejected? Is my baby going to be rejected? But again, that's where us working one-on-one with expectant moms and whoever's in charge of working with the adoptive parents and preparing them well so that we can all do our job together and it works together. But it's important to make sure they know what happened.
Okay. Andy, I think you had some more perspective here.
Yeah, I just want to talk from a social worker perspective. So as social workers, we have a code of ethics that we have to follow, and we are licensed. If you're an MSW, I know there are some social workers who are not licensed, who are working in this area, which I don't think is ethical. I think you need to be licensed, but we have a standard that we have to hold to. And I see this in foster care and infant private adoption, international adoption, all across the board. We see files presented to prospective parents that all of the information isn't there. And I'm not talking about information that we're going to find out later as the child grows, which does happen. Your child changes developmentally. There's going to be changes. Tina knows, as an adult adoptee, you start processing things as you grow in your life when you have kids. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about things they know about right now. They are not all in that case file. I've never once seen a case file where all of the information is presented. And what ethically, what frustrates me about that is that's coercion. You are making these parents, not giving them all of the information, and you're coercing these parents, just like Carrie was talking about, to take a child that they may not be prepared for, because there are agencies that you do get a bonus if you place a child. That happens. And so as a social worker, that's where I think that they failed. They need to be held accountable from a social work standpoint. So that's my 2 cents on that.
It's okay. I didn't know. So it's so funny. It's like Krista's has a social work background too. And I just didn't know it was like, whoa, 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 so this is super fun. I want to talk about another aspect that definitely connects to social work. This idea of the macro and the micro. So like that we're working on bigger issues that we're seeing systemically while working one-on-one with people who are experiencing the ramifications of those systemic issues. So for me, I'm a mother raising 2 children with disabilities, and one biological, one adopted. And I don't mean to remove adoption from the equation, but for a moment, let's just talk about what it's like to raise a child, just to parent a child with a disability. And this idea of who can handle what. And like some people are chosen by God to like do this and like take up my cross. By the way, biological came first in my family. So I didn't choose originally to parent a child with a disability. And so kind of the whole idea of who can handle what I know that that's just kind of where we are. And we really, like, we have to place babies. You're placing a baby now, Carrie, right? Like we have to place babies today, and we can't just roll the dice and decide who goes where. So we have to use this language of who can handle what. But I really think that from just a bigger picture parenting perspective, what I experience as a parent to children with disabilities is that there's nowhere in the parenting narrative in the world where my experience as a parent fits. And adoptive parents can feel that too, where like my kid and my experience as a parent does not fit the major, like, milestones, the experiences, the fuzzy feelings that everybody has. Like, but my experience is valid. It's good. It's just hard to find people who relate to it. The major narrative, which is all about, what sells, is not, like, does not fit. And I think that the adoption industry has an opportunity to, one person at a time, kind of rewrite that narrative, right? So like even outside of educating parents so that they can so that whenever they decide what they can handle, they're making the decision from a place of education, from a place of fear, not from a place of anything besides like really taking stock with the guidance of a licensed social worker. But then also this idea that like, there are opportunities, right, for parents who do say, okay, I think we can do this, we can handle this, we do want to adopt this child. Let's see, what is the diagnosis that we do know about? Let's talk to the local children's hospital. Let's figure out how we can connect parents who have children who are teenagers with that diagnosis, adults with that diagnosis. One of my followers in this whole conversation, she's an adult with cystic fibrosis who reached out and said that there was a panel that she participated in, and it was all expectant parents in the audience and adults with the diagnosis that these parents had prenatally. And that panel gave those parents so much hope and so much of a charge about like, look at these kids and look at their life, and what a privilege that I have to get to raise a child with this diagnosis. It's not all about what you can handle. There's actually some really hopeful things that we can inject into that. And how cool would it be for that to happen, first of all, at every children's hospital, but then for adoption agencies to be connected to those opportunities so that hopeful adopted parents can go to those events, so that it's not just for those who are going to raise biological children. So anyway, I know I said a lot there, but I do a lot. I kind of live in the macro professionally, and that's kind of where my mind stays. And so I just think about like the bigger parenting narrative. We need to make room for all kinds of experiences, and the adoption community here has an opportunity to make that change, at least in our camp. So
very good. Here we go. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I also have a social work background. I'm not a practicing social worker, but I also have a social work background. That's what I got my degree in. I have a BSW. I adopted internationally. And so I think that there are several ways that the professionals failed. I just wanted to share a story because I think that sometimes in situations, and even just talking about a subject like adoption dissolution, it's so uncomfortable. Nobody wants to talk about this, and people don't understand that this is really common. This is not like a one-off thing. Like, this has been happening for years, and not just in international adoption, though it is high. I will say, like, I'll be the first to admit to you that there is, I think, a lack of training and a lack of education across the board, as we have all said, in every type of adoption and foster care. But I can tell you, as a parent who adopted internationally, a lot of the education I had to go and find myself. I wasn't required to do it. And so I do think that there is a little bit of a disproportionate amount of children who have been adopted internationally that unfortunately adoption dissolutions do happen. And so that can overlap into things like foster care, because they don't have there's not an opportunity for a kinship placement when you have been adopted and placed in a completely different country. And so then if a relinquishment happens, then they're entering our foster care system. And then that's a whole other set of things, right? And so I just kind of wanted to share a story because I think it's really easy, for us to say, it's one or the other, and it's both. I feel like we need to just all together have more of a collaboration between families and professionals across the board. And I think that both are responsible. Like, as a parent, whether I ever adopted or not, like, wouldn't I want to just continually grow as a parent, be a better parent, but I think especially in adoption, there's an extra added layer of complexity there that I have to continually and should continually educate myself. But I also know so many people come to this and they have no clue what they're doing. So then that is the responsibility of the professionals to come in and say, we are serving you and we are coming alongside you. And so we need to provide you what you don't know. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that there's a ton of things that went wrong, as far as there's a complete lack of things going on in the and motivations right off the bat. Like, that should be number one. Why are you coming to this table? And so I wonder, okay, why were there things that were never addressed in the home study? And that doesn't mean that person, that family shouldn't adopt, because a lot of people come to this table with unrealistic expectations. But okay, we see the breakdown. So before we take the next step, here's some training, here's some education for you. But if that is never met with, then we're going to have a perpetuating problem, right? And I know for me, kind of like what Allison's saying, that micro, meso, macro, you have to think holistically about the big picture. And I will never forget when I was getting my social work degree, and I was doing field work with Child Protective Services. Foster care is actually mine and my husband's background. That's how we met. He worked in foster care for 8 years. And I, as a really ignorant young 20-something, getting her degree, came, wanting to do things in foster care and help these kids, and, all the things that we hear a lot of parents say, and the, Child Protective Services supervisor that I was doing my field placement under, she allowed me to sit in on a staff meeting one day, and, as a development trainee, we watched this documentary that Frontline did years ago called Who Killed Adam Man? And I would encourage you, if you haven't ever listened or read about that case, but it was about a little boy in New York City who was 5 years old who died at the hands of his parents because of abuse. And so the question that they posed was, okay, yes, he died at the hand of his parents, but if we look at the holistic picture of what is happening, what happened in this case, was he really the were they really like the only ones who failed him? Because when you looked at the big picture, there were a lot of professionals involved who did not document things, who hid things, who didn't report things, who all of these things. That child could have been taken out of that environment. There could have possibly been some restoration happening, which is the point of foster care. But instead, because of all these failings, it led up to his death. And so that is something that we need to think of there needs to be, like, the professionals fail, absolutely. Parents fail, absolutely. That's why we have to have both. But there's got to be like a mutual ground of support, I think. So that's that.
Kristen, can I ask a question? You've adopted internationally, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. Classes and preparation that you did during your home study process and all that, and I don't want to get into naming agencies
Sure.
or anything, but was it a class like of multiple people that you did your education with, or was it one-on-one?
No, so that is something that, another thing that people need to understand is, typically with international adoption, because it's an international adoption, you can work with an agency from anywhere. I didn't have to choose a local agency. I live in Texas, but I could have worked with an agency in Washington, because that's just the way that it works. So most of the training is not done in person. Now, we had training that we did in person, but it was training that we found, but all the rest of the training was online. And so I think too, like, that's another added layer of complexity for international adoption, is there's also not a whole lot of community there. This isn't about me, so I'm not going to get into my story, but kind of like what Allison was saying, of like, sometimes it's you feel like you don't fit in the typical narrative. I have felt like that a ton. Even in the adoption community, I feel left out of the conversation a lot because it's centered around other types of adoption. And so international adoption is like, y'all are the worst, get away. Like, you couldn't hack it. You're not going to be a foster parent. You didn't want to have, or couldn't, or whatever. And that wasn't our motivation, have an open adoption. So you went with an international adoption as a cop-out, which is not not all international adoptive families are like that. But there is definitely, for sure, I think, a complete lack of support and lack of community, which is further isolating, which further stigma, has a shame stigma around it, and all of those things. Kind of like that friend who came to you at 9:00, she probably didn't have anywhere else to go. She didn't have anybody else to call. That's kind of where we're at.
Things that maybe us adoption professionals could do is, and logistically, I mean, I don't know how it could work. We, for Abiding Love, we're a small agency, so we can make that happen, but we do one-on-one. And so all of our education is the caseworker face-to-face in the home, or them face-to-face one-on-one in our office, going through grief and loss, going through separation, going through cultural differences, all of the list of things that we go through. Because as an attorney, one of the reasons I started Abiding Love was I saw my clients who were doing the home studies, they were watching videos on YouTube, and they just checked off that they watched it, and they're like, oh, we're educated to adopt. And I was like, no, you aren't. No, you aren't. So I'm just thinking maybe one of the things, no offense to my client, but so I'm just saying maybe one of the things we as adoption professionals could do is to really start working on making a more personal education and one-on-one to really tailor it to that family, so that they have all the tools necessary. And again, I understand with international adoptions, they have huge numbers, and we're a small agency, but I'm just throwing that out.
I think that's good too, because then when it, like, from a disability perspective or a special needs perspective, then you're able to really get into the nitty gritty of what boxes did you check when you were thinking about what you could do, and neither try to sway them one way or the other, but definitely talking about what that really means. And like, for instance, both of my kids have Down syndrome, and the Down syndrome community, we're definitely the exception, but it is so vibrant and so lively, and the adoption Down syndrome community is one that, like, that's where you can get the most, like, the best education about here's exactly, you know, what to look for in your area, here are the organizations to look into. And so all that to say, adoption professionals that could point them to the right organization based on diagnosis and that sort of thing, you can do that with that one-on-one experience, but you can't if it's just attend a class and check a box.
One last thing I want to throw in here too, when we're talking about, you know, meso, macro, micro, one thing that has failed, and I think all of us can agree, is that the state and federal systems also need to be addressed and fixed. I mean, that's just obvious. If you're in adoption at any point, if you're in foster care at any point, it's pretty recognizable that there is no consistency across the board, and every state is different. And even federally, like, they're just like, whatever the state wants. And there are some great rules. There are rules there to protect children. Like in Michigan, we have a rule to protect children who are, we have consequences for parents who choose adoption dissolution. They go on our central registry in Michigan, which affects their jobs, there's like where they can go on school grounds. It affects their lives. So we have consequences, but that's just Michigan. So I just want to throw that out there that, you know, in general, at the very macro level, federally, state laws all need addressed.
So quick follow-up on that. Michigan, you have that law. What about the rest of the states? Like, all of you on here, do you know of similar laws in your states? Could this family go adopt another child, or any family that makes this path? Could they, you know, could they go make this choice and adopt another child?
In Arkansas, you can. Like, I know a family that dissolved an adoption and then it went on to adopt. And yeah, I mean, I'm not going to get into the details of that, but I know that they can. And but that specific family, it was very different from the case that led us to having this conversation, you know? I don't know.
So Andy, I've got a quick question for you, and then we can jump over to a new question, but I want to ask you around what you were messaging me about mirroring.
Oh yeah, mirroring. So on my social platform, I did do a little, like, what do they call it? I talked from, and I'm also an adoptive parent. So I talked a little bit from an adoptive parent standpoint, where first of all, let me state that I don't think adoption dissolution is a good thing. I think it's traumatic. It obviously adds trauma to the child. I am against it. However, there are very few cases where it can be beneficial for the child. And I'm not talking about cases where adoptive parents find other, like group homes for their kids to live in. I'm talking about actual adoption dissolution where they find a second family. Sometimes I have seen it be very beneficial for the child. The child just in the family, there's not clicking. Genetic mirroring, as we all know, is where a biological child sees something that's familiar, and we grow up in this environment of what's familiar, and our brain recognizes that. That stays with us. I'm an infant adoptee, and that still stays with us. My half-sister and I, we do the same hand motions. And we're half, and we didn't grow up together. But so sometimes in these adoption dissolutions, sometimes it's not a good fit. Sometimes there's behavior issues. It's a safety issue for the child. Sometimes in these cases, as the child develops, diagnoses do come out, and the family, does not have the support. They don't have the support system. They don't have the education. Nobody's willing to help them because, as we all know, as soon as they sign those papers, usually the agents are like, bye, never talk to you again. And that includes foster care. You're on your own. So they feel very lost. I'm not trying to place blame here. What I'm saying is that sometimes there is a situation where a child can go to a second family and something clicks. There's something about that family that may mirror more biologically. I mean, if you have, this is a general example, but if you have a very introverted child who's been adopted into a very loud family who is very extroverted naturally, and there's other diagnoses. I'm not just talking about that. I'm talking about, major trauma diagnoses. that may not be a good fit for that child. That child may need a more one-on-one personal family attention. And I'm saying that not to be the devil's advocate. Again, I totally don't agree with adoption dissolution. I'm just saying that there is that aspect to consider, that sometimes the way the trauma is, the way, you know, your brain is working, the way you are genetically built, that's just, it can be cultural too. It can be racial. I've seen all of these. I'm just naming off things that I've seen in my own personal life and work. And so, yeah, that's what we were talking about.
And
tonight.
I think it's important to note that that can't be prevented. That's why we're not placing it, you know, that comes back to the way your brain works, the way that you're wired, you know, genetic mirroring. It's just like this beautiful thing. But with adoption, it's like adoption professionals can't go in the brain and match based on that, you know. And so we have to have a little bit of like grace there, knowing that sometimes that is the situation.
Yeah, and I think that's what I'm saying is in those situations that there needs to be grace. Like I can't tell you how many people I've had message me in the last week who have been in that situation, and truly, like, I've listened to their stories and they legit are in that situation. I've had second families message me and say, we're the second family, and the child was this way in this home, and in this home we don't know what happened, but they're an entirely different child and they function much better. So, you know, it does happen. And yeah, sometimes we can't explain it. From a trauma, I'm a trauma trained person. From a trauma standpoint, sometimes we just don't know enough about the brain to see what's going on. Nobody's gonna, you know, brain scan every child to figure out exactly what's going on, but it just happens. There's just, the word I use for it is click, but that's a very layman's term for much more scientific explanation.
If I can add in here, one of the things that adoption professionals have tried to do in order to protect from dissolutions is the post-placement requirements, right? And every state has their own post-placement requirement. Every country has a different agreement with the State Department as to how many post-placements. With international adoptions, there are post-placements that are even well past the adoption actual even being redone here in the United States, because even though the adoption might be finalized in the other country, sometimes, most of the time, depending if it's a Hague, non-Hague, all of that stuff, you've got to re-adopt here and do all that stuff. So it'll go way past. But in my experience, and again, just my experience, both my clients, some of which work for me now as caseworkers, they have, the post-placements were a joke. They were just basically, again, checking off, okay, child is still alive. And they weren't really going into the nitty-gritty of how is this family coming together as a family unit? What are some of the weaknesses? What can we do to help support? And I feel like the State Department, and the idea was to put these post-placements in place in order to help support identified needs. But the professionals on the ground are failing and not doing it. They're just checking off, saying, okay, child's still alive, he or she is at this weight, they were at that weight, and everything's great. And so we as adoption professionals need to hold ourselves to a higher standard, that we're not just, again, checking off child's breathing, but you know, that everything's going well. And even in domestic adoptions, we get flack for this with our post placement. I want to make sure that what they promised the mom, the expectant mom with the open adoption, they're following through with. What are some things that we can do to help in facilitating that relationship, to help grow that relationship? You know, with a transracial adoption, what can we do, even though the child might be an infant? What can we start doing? What different community groups can you get involved in? Those kinds of things. So we professionals need to, I'm an executive director of an agency. It is my responsibility to make sure my caseworkers on the ground are doing that. And I look at myself in the mirror first. And we at Abiding Love, we've made a whole lot of changes in the last 3 years. So, and then to the other comment about whether dissolution, if they can re-adopt, I have done all of our licensing in Georgia. I've done all of our licensing in Alabama. I've done all of our licensing in Florida, and I'm working on another state. And I can tell you, in none of those regulations from the state have I ever seen anything regarding dissolution. The question is, have you ever had a home study denied? It's not, have you ever had an adoption dissolved or that. So we also need to be working with our DCFs, DFACs, all of those things to be adding that to our regulations. I'm trying to get Georgia and specifically Georgia right now to add in about things that social workers should be checking off for transracial adoption before we just say, oh yeah, absolutely, adopt this baby. So we need to be working, making sure our people on the ground are doing more than just checking boxes, and we need to be working with our state, whoever is doing the regulations within our state suite to meet these requirements, because it's on the ground, we got no responsibility to it, and that's a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of things you see, there aren't many laws that protect different things, like this case, right? There aren't the topic we're talking about. There aren't laws all over the board that cover that. So Ashley and Tina, I wanna get you guys talking a little bit. So I think we've all had different reactions. My initial reaction, completely different to my educated reaction. So things happen, I hear about adoption dissolution, and my opinion about it is a little different than it was when I read, for the first time. So I'd love to get Tina or Ashley, what your reactions are, how do you feel, and maybe some education.
Okay. I don't really know. I think I just read the headline and I was like, I'm out. I'll be very honest. I did not know that adoption dissolution was a thing. I did not know. I've been talking with my adopted mother about this. I just had a conversation with her on the phone before we met here, and I told her what we were doing, and she was like, that's awesome. I'm so glad that you're working with those people because parents need to do better than we did. And I'm like, but y'all did pretty good. But, it's just, she's always like looking for further education in that. And she said, yeah, I know quite a few people who have dissolved adoptions. And I was like, you never told me. She was like, no, because that would confirm your deepest fear as an adoptee. And so I think for me, my initial reaction was, I don't know, it was very hard for me to not take it personally, just hearing about it. And this was my first introduction to it. And I guess I was really surprised that it is, I spent the first few years of my life wanting a family to commit to me. I think often adoptees feel like commodities or a case number. And I know that I felt that a lot in my time in foster care. Because my foster parents purposefully chose not to bond with me. I was there too long. I was inconvenient. So I think that, there's I don't know, I guess it was hard for me because I was like, I don't really want to think about this. I hadn't really taken the time to think about the aspect of, rejection or that aspect of adoption that we feel, because there hasn't really been something that I've shared about recently. But then like learning this new story and just learning about adoption dissolution in general, I was like, oh gosh, like this is hard. And I think I just was like, it goes back to education. Like you have to educate better, and you have to keep reminding families that adoption will always revolve around the fact that the child's first family or parent is choosing not to parent them. And you have to keep that in mind in every aspect of what you're doing, because I think the difference. And I do think that there has to be, we were talking, I'm in an adoptee support group, and we were talking about this last night, and we were talking that it needs to differ between infant and foster care adoptions as well, because it's different. I think a lot of people coming from foster care are like, yeah, we know that in a sense we may not be wanted because we've been told that, you know, so it's different, I think, in that. Like, it's not, I think for me, it was traumatic to hear about it, but then again, it wasn't surprising because I was like, well, yeah, I know that sometimes, you know, people make these decisions for their children. But I don't know, it's been very complex for me. It's been really good for me to talk to my mom about it because she's very understanding and compassionate in that. And she told me that she heard about an adoption dissolution when she was like, had her first child, which was like 30 years ago or something like that. So a long time ago. And she was like, I was mad as hell. Like, you know, so it's not a new thing, which I didn't know, but my mom was like, yeah, I know. And it's just interesting because I think in every aspect of adoption and foster care, I keep going back to my mom being like, hey, what about this? She's like, yeah, I know. She's like, I've read the Body Keep score. I'm like, Mom, you are way ahead of me in every aspect of my life. But I think it's good because she's willing to talk about it. And, you know, and I remember asking her as a child, like, are you going to send me back if you don't like me? Because, you know, it's just something we think about as adoptees, you know, we're like, because in some ways, some of us have felt disposable in that area. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you.
Oh, did you want me to share?
Thank you. I mean, it's really, I've got goosebumps. So
Yeah. So there's a couple of things just from my perspective, and again, I recognize that this group is not the norm because we're in the throes of this kind of education all the time. And we're very proactive in it. And so when you're just hearing all this for the first time and drinking from this fire hose, it's really hard to kind of take it all in and understand, especially if this is such a new concept. And so when I read the headlines for me, because I have sat in countless classes at conferences and stuff, I was not shocked by the header itself because I know this happens. So my initial reaction is always go to the community comments and how are people reacting and how are they feeling about it. And obviously, and I'm speaking, you know, I'm listening to these adoptee voices, and this is so hard for me to sit in because as a birth mother, I'm the voice that did exactly what everyone is so disgusted by, right? I made a decision. Now, I recognize that their situation as adoptive parents that walked into this and proactively made these decisions is not the same as me making a decision in crisis, right? But at the end of the day, stripping all of that out, at the end of the day, a decision was made for a child's life to go somewhere else because of the inadequacies that I felt as a parent. And there are parallels in that all day in that story. And you know, because the number one reaction from adopted parents was, well, if this was her biological child, she wouldn't do this, right? And I'm going, hello, birth mom, I am a biological child, and I did do that. And I loved Allison's perspective when she was talking about checking the boxes, and we need to prepare homes for all types of parenting issues, right? If it's just a parenting issue, I can get behind that. But when we're coming to the table, women that are pregnant in crisis making these decisions, a lot of this education is falling on deaf ears because this is sometimes the smallest issue that we are dealing with in our life. This is literally crisis. It has to be this or this because I can't wrap my mind around, okay, good, there's hope in diagnosis and there's hope. I'm just deciding, can I carry this baby to term or not? And so I get the need for options counseling and empowering parenting, and I really am passionate about that. But I also know when things get really hard and when everything else is really big and your decision has kind of a ticking time when it expires, because this baby's going to come out at some point, when you have a timeline that you have to get this decision made by, I may be the only person, not me specifically, but from the birth mom side, I think it's easy to take pause and say, I understand putting a child in a different home because of crisis, overwhelm, a lack of education and support. I get, for half a second, I can get behind that woman and understand why these decisions are made, with really at the core, I believe, for what we believe is the best for the child. Now, we can have all the conversation in the world that we, you know, and again, I'm wearing my domestic infant adoption hat, who made a educated decision on adoption. I picked the family, so this is not talking about things that I can't speak to. But I can understand that for those brief seconds, when this decision has to be made, I can understand doing things out of fear and crisis and overwhelm. That doesn't make any of this okay. There's definitely ownership and trauma that I've inflicted on my son that I place that I have to own, that's really painful to sit in. And so all of this for the child, obviously this is about how did we fail him? But I can sit in that piece and say, when everyone's reaction is, well, if this was biological, you'd never give that baby to somebody else. And I'm going, okay. You know, I mean, that's the reality of the birth mom language that I hear. When the adoptee hears that language, they're going, you know, when Tina is so brilliant, you know, talking about foster care, she's like, well, I'm not surprised. Isn't that what we were raised to believe that happens? You know, and I'm sitting here going, you guys are so angry at her for making this decision, but I can understand the decision.
Yeah, I think when I saw your perspective, when I listened to your stories, first off, my heart sank, and I thought, I'm sitting here so upset that people would do this and do adoption dissolution, but I made that choice too. So I'm really appreciative of you opening our eyes. So I had a bunch of questions come in, but I don't think we have time for a lot of them. I do want to ask about, I got this in DM a couple of times and on a comment. So sharing the child's story. Now, this is tricky for me to say because I wrote a book about my birth mother journey. I kept, you know, my son's name out of it and any personal details of him, and it's focused on me, but you know, I wrote a book about it. So I want to get your opinions on sharing their stories and what that looks like, and how do we, as a birth mother, like I want to protect my son, and I want to be able to educate other birth mothers and adoptive parents on what to share, what not to, what's appropriate. So I'd love anybody who wants to speak up, anybody, everybody, like this is an important topic. We gotta.
So I want to share really quick, and then I'm going to let the adoptive parents who are raising these adopted children speak, because if you follow me or know anything about me, I share my story all over the place, and my son and his name and all of those things. I know that a lot of families come at me and say, you know, how does his mom feel about that? And I'm like, well, which mom are you talking about? Because but I recognize the who have these individual agreements, and then what's just public etiquette in sharing these things. And so, you know, and what works for your individual adoption relationships and what's, you know, on this larger scale. And I try really, really hard, even, yes, I share pictures, and yes, you know, I use his name and things like that. I try really hard, and I know I'm not perfect at this, but I try really hard to make sure that the things that I'm sharing are 100% from my personal perspective, that I am sharing a picture of him, but I'm talking about my issues and my trauma and my work and my lens that I'm looking at this relationship, and I don't speak for him. Now, everyone has very different polarizing opinions about whether you should share family photos with your kids, but everyone in the nation on social media posts family photos. Right. And so am I just sharing about my family and sharing family pictures, or am I using this as a platform and as a story to share about my child? And I use it as a platform and a story to share my story as a birth mother. Yes, I use his pictures, but I'm not ever speaking to how he should be or is feeling in that space. I'm not perfect at it, but I try really hard to be very intentional about that. That's all I'm going to say about that. But I would love to hear from the adoptive moms in sharing that.
Well, I just want to say one more thing on that. So Ashley, sometimes I get so jealous that you post pictures, because in my agreement, I actually am, it is legally not able to ever use his name to post a picture, anything like that. I am legally not able to do that in my contract. So I do get jealous sometimes.
Would you if you could?
I do think I would, because there has been so many times where I've wanted to share with the world, like that eats me alive, that I can't share with the world how proud I am and show a picture. Like it eats me alive. If you looked in my house, like I've got pictures of him but I can't post those other places, but I've got him everywhere. I wish I could share. I do.
We, there was a draft of our agreement that included that, and it was just standard. But my son's birth mom was like, I want to share pictures. And I was like, I'm fine with you sharing pictures. And so we just both were like, she's going to do that.
Yeah.
Change accordingly. Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, I think that's pretty standard, right? To keep, well, we should have asked Carrie, but she's got to go have a baby. So, or like someone's having a baby. But anyway, I would be curious to know if that's just standard in the document.
Yeah, I think for me as an adoptive parent, honestly, I feel like you're going to hear so many different perspectives on this, even from adoptee to adoptee, I think. And I really want to pass the mic to Andy and Tina on this. As adult adoptees, I think so much of it can be dependent. If you are a foster parent, you better not be posting images of those kids, because you are not their legal parent. And so you cannot be sharing images of children who actually are not legally yours. And I honestly feel this way about international adoption too. I have a really difficult time when families who have adopted or who are in the process of adopting internationally, of course they're excited when they accept the referral to say, I am saying yes to this child, and they get that first picture. That wasn't a part of our story. That's just not how the country that we adopted from Japan, and that's just not how it worked there. Every country is different, but I know that there are a lot of moms who it's like their new mom, they're just excited, and so they're sharing an image of this little one, or even children who are waiting internationally, and so they're searching for families, and so they're using social media as a tool to try and reach people to maybe hopefully get someone who will say yes and adopt them. I have many different feelings on that, but for me, I'm you don't even, if they're not if they don't legally have your last name and a gavel has not been banged, and you don't have your certificate of adoption saying that you are this child's legal parent, then you don't have but I think for me, I, as someone who loves to educate and feels that it is important to educate, I think what you need to ask yourself, as an adoptive parent, is if my child were to read this, how would they feel about what I am saying about them? And I honestly think any parent should be asking that. We shouldn't be putting our kids worst moments on the internet or anything like that. But I feel like I can educate about because I feel like there's a big gap in a lack of trauma-informed training. I feel like that's just across the board something that needs to be happening more. And so I can share what I'm doing as an adopted parent from a trauma lens and how that informs my parenting, ways in which because of past trauma, I now parent in this way instead, because I know that if I did it this other way, it's going to send this message to my child. But I can do that without sharing details of my child's story. I can do that without sharing his life history and what brought him into our family. And I think that is just something that we need to remember. My son's story is his. It's not mine. And I would I'm just getting chills thinking about it, just kind of in anger and frustration. But oh my gosh, I would never want anyone else to hold my child's story. They don't know how to protect it. They don't know what to do with it. And he should not be hearing details about himself. He shouldn't be the last to know. He should be the first to know, because he needs to be the one to process that over time. And we have always been, from like day one, like, talked about adoption, talked about it positively, holds the space for the grief, acknowledge what he's lost, like all of those things. But kind of like Andy said earlier, like that, how that works itself out, like it's going to process differently over time as they grow and as they have the capacity to like actually take in what happened to them. And my son is 6 years old, and I have for sure seen that. There are conversations like we're having now at 6 that I thought we were going to get here at like 12, but we here now. Okay. All right. Okay, let's do this. But it would not, be okay for me to, it's my job as a mom to protect him. And so I would be doing him a disservice by not protecting what is rightfully his. And so I think that there is absolutely a way that we can share and we can educate without sharing details. And it is 100% okay to set that boundary. Even now, I'll have, because it's a transracial adoption, I'll have people ask me like, oh, is he adopted? Like, yes, he is. And, automatically they're like, well, what happened to his real mom? And I'm like, well, first of all, one real mom is standing right in front of you. So bye. And second of all, that's not for you to know. Like, I will just straight up say like, those are not details that we share. Put up that boundary. It's not theirs to know. I'm gonna pass the mic. Go, Andy, Tina.
I thought I'd share on this. So I think so my adoption was closed. So there hasn't been communication for almost 20 years. And so I think for us, and just like my story and just everything, it's just, I think I find myself on the other end of, I want to share my story, but I also want to protect my mom. And so I'm like I like everything I share, I'm like, okay, I'm imagining she's reading this, because who knows, she might find it. It's why I'm not public. It's why I try to be really careful about everything I say about her, because I don't want her to think that I think less of her or anything like that. And so I guess for me, like my 20 years ago, so we didn't really have that. And I think in educating other, hopeful adoptive parents or foster parents, she did not overshare our story. I know that our story, and in being closed, I think there was a lot of safety in that, because it was just like, well, we can't share that with anyone. We just we legally cannot. So it's just like, that's what we do. So I think that for me though, I think like everyone else saying, like, it's not. And I think from I really like the way that Ashley shares her story and her son's story. And like she said, like, she doesn't share anything that he doesn't already know, because he needs to know first. And I think that's already a very hard boundary. And that is a hard part. And a lot of adoptive parents come to me and say, how do I share my child's story with them? And so I think that, you need to focus on that first and not share your child's story, because it's not yours to share. And so I think I've been really blessed to be able to have a family that respects that, and that, talks with us about our story, and we always knew, and there were no surprises in that. So yeah.
So I'll jump in. So I'm going to address this from all three of my angles, as Ashley calls them, lanes. Number one, I'm going to do the least emotional and work towards the emotional one. Foster care. As a foster parent, I just have to say that, like, even as an adoptee and being a foster parent, I've screwed this up. I get into, the salon chair and somebody starts asking questions and I'm not thinking long term. I'm just in that moment of, I got out of the house without my kids. So, you know, first of all, there's grace. Like if you're listening to this and you're sitting here going, oh, I feel so awful. There is grace in that, and you can start now. And just all of us have. And that goes, you know, so for foster care, it's a really difficult story. And now I am extremely protective of her story. The one public fact I share is that we do have a connection with her two sisters, because that's a sibling relationship. And I have permission to talk about that from their mother, because we want to encourage sibling interaction for obvious reasons. But sharing my daughter's story is incredibly important to me. And that's, you know, that's through foster care, because those details drives me nuts when people come up to me and be like, well, what did our parents do wrong? It is none of your dang business what they did wrong. The point is she's in our family. You don't need to know her history. It's not your job. You're not privy to that. You're not the one raising her. Why do you need to know this? For your own drama high? Is that what it is? Like, I think that's what drives me so nuts about this conversation, is because it is we get a boost of serotonin and adrenaline when we hear about who's done what wrong. It just drives me nuts, because you're not the one parenting. It's none of your business. And, you know, I still have to, as an adopted parents as well, like, just because this is foster care doesn't mean that I don't have compassion and a heart for her parents. I don't want to drag them under the bus. What the reason that we're in this situation together, like, it is foster care. We, you know, closed or open foster care, whatever that looks like in our life, it's not my job to badmouth the parents. I, as a Christian social worker, it's my job to give them grace and compassion and, you know, education, if that's my position, and support them in any way I can as I walk through a foster care journey with them, because the ultimate is reunification, which is their best interest for that child and the parents. So, you know, as an adoptive parent, what does that look like going forth? It means I'm not going to tell you about, I don't need, when I introduce you to my children, I don't need you to ask what is adopted. I cannot tell you how many times adoptive parents understand this. Like, we walk into church, here are my children. Oh, what are their names? Blah, 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 blah. Oh, which one's adopted? Well, first of all, how'd you know that? I mean, we do share that we have one. And then they try to pick which one of my children's adopted. And they always cracks me up. But so as an adoptive parent, we don't tell, you know, I do have a platform, but I don't go into, when I'm introducing my family, I don't say, here are my children, one of them is adopted. I just say their names and ages like a normal parent. If somebody wants to know which child is adopted, I'll say it doesn't matter to their face. I will say, why do you need to know? This isn't your business. It's my job as an adoptive parent to protect them. And that's on social media. I protect on social media and I don't share stories in my actual Instagram. In my posts, I'll maybe share stories, but and I also have, this is a side hilarious note, I have an introvert child who I am not allowed to post unless he gives me permission. He's so introverted. And he'll ask me, are you posting that on Instagram? No, I am not. And then I have one extroverted child, hey mom, will you post this on Instagram? And that's just parenting. Now, from an adoptee perspective, you know, I grew up in an age where there wasn't social media. And the only reason you would know that I was adopted is if you were in our church family or you were there when it happened. this is hard for me to talk about because it is, I think, one thing my parents learned later, but I don't think that, like I said, we all make mistakes. And I think my parents liked to brag a little bit that they had 2 adopted children. And so that was part of our introduction growing up. These are our children. Here's our 2 bio kids. Here's our 2 adopted kids. And I don't think they did it intentionally. I think it was, it's the 80s. We didn't know about trauma. We weren't addressing saviorism. They did 95% of the stuff they did right. But what ended up happening is my story started getting told without my permission. I'd walk into a room of my parents' friends and they'd be talking about me. They'd be talking about my mom, and I'm allowed to talk about this. My younger sister deals with some disabilities. I cannot tell you how many times I walked into a room and adults were talking about what we had wrong. And was it because we were adopted? Was it nature? Was it nurture? And I felt so used. I felt like a commodity. I felt like a science research project. It was harm. I remember one time I had to stand up to my own adopted family at a Christmas thing and tell them to stop talking about my sister that way. And we had to stand together as the adopted kids. And I have adopted cousins, and we sit together at Christmas because our immediate families talked about us like that growing up. And so we bonded together. We're the adopted cousins. And so my story was told before I had permission. There's a lot of things. And then as I grew, I met my biological parents. And one of my parents decided that they could tell my story. And so I would when we'd spend time together, we'd walk into her church. And guess what? I was the science experiment. It just went the other way from my birth parent. And it was all about the story. It was never about me. It was always about the story. And this worst child abuse survivor, but I was so raped emotionally that was ripped from my hands. And I've had to work through that in trauma therapy. So I think it's incredibly important. And then from a Christian aspect, I grew up in a church and I became a teenager, and they'd start asking me to speak first, they just used me as an example in Sunday school, comparing the whole Christ-like adoption thing. Don't even get me started on that. But they would use my story in sermons. I can't just, I'm not a thing you put on a pedestal and say, look at this, and so that just kind of reaffirmed again that I was and something to be bought and sold and used. And a lot of things my parents did right, but that was one thing that really stripped me of my dignity. And so yeah, that's, sorry. I got really emotional and I got really talky. I didn't mean to those stories. So as adoptive parents, you can understand how protective you need to be. And, birth moms, if you're listening to this, the unhealthiness in that situation is an unhealthy relationship. I know there are plenty of birth moms who are so protective and are so gentle and kind with their children's stories. And I appreciate that. So that's that was a very relational issue, but, we'll hold these stories precious to our hearts.
Can I add something? I also think that it's important to hold them precious even within your own family, like immediate family. Like my adoptive mother has not told I have 7 siblings. I have a lot of siblings. My adoptive mother has not given any information to my sisters who I can trust 100% that I didn't give them firsthand. Like we went through all my paperwork, we read everything, we know all the nitty gritty. But my mom said, whatever you want to tell them, you can, but I'm not telling them anything. And that's within your own family. So I think it's also very important to let your adoptee tell their siblings as they see.
That's a really excellent point. Now, my sister and I are in adults, but that is, I would say, that's an excellent point. And we do, like, as an adoptive parent, we've seen that a little bit in our home. And as our kids grow, what do we tell our kids about their sister or any future foster care placements we have? Because, yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, I think it's great that we just got so many different sides of the spectrum, because here I'm telling, Ashley, I'm jealous she posts pictures. But then I'm hearing this whole other side where you have to be thoughtful about what you're posting and what you're saying. So I just really appreciate you all. We're past an hour. I have to go. I think that this has been such a great roundtable. I think we have to do it again. It's not really an option at this point. It was very informative and wonderful. So thank you all, ladies, for being on. Do you have any final remarks, statements?
First, just thank you. And I agree. We need to have more conversations like this. I think people need to remember that I love the online community. I love this adoption online community so much. I can tell you, I found so much community. I found real life friends from this app. I get it. But I just want to remind people that where the magic happens is off the app. It's even if it's this, virtual, some of y'all I have met in person and some of y'all I haven't, but where the nitty gritty and true community and where all the magic happens is taking it off the app, even if you don't live close, even if it's Marco Polo or whatever, but it's taking it, yeah, but it's taking it off of that. We're getting we're only getting a tiny little snippet of each other on social media. And so I think that is so important to know, and that adoption is complex. It's all going to overlap in so many different ways and so many different issues that we didn't even get to here. So that's all.
I think we got the tiny surface here. we're yeah.
It's like that ego, the iceberg and the water. We don't even have a snowflake on top of that water yet.
But it was good. I think it was good. I think it got people thinking about the right things. So thanks for having me, y'all.
Thanks, everybody, for being here.
Thanks, Hope, for putting this together. Bye, guys.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.